Hello, my name is Mehdi Gassemi, and in this short video I will talk to you about WJT Mitchell's text image. So Mitchell starts his text by evoking a few important terms that enable us to situate images, or the concept of the image really, as part of our contemporary society and cultures. He says that we live in an age of global media cultures where electronic or digital communications, that is telephones, email, social media, the internet, and all that stuff, have created a world dominated by constant media production and consumption. Just like we need an atmosphere to live, we also need to have a media sphere to exist in the world. We cannot possibly understand culture and society, Mitchell tells us, without understanding the role media play in our lives as individuals and groups, nations, and so on. That's also true about understanding the history of our cultures and societies. So in sum, cultural history, the history of our culture, is primarily media history. It is the study of how media changed through time and how it helped to create new cultural practices that ultimately transformed and are transforming societies. So remember from the first class, we use media for communication, and media basically means, the word media means the technological tools we use in order to communicate. Now, the invention of new tools or media of communication are in turn based on technological innovation. Mitchell also tells us that throughout history we've had many media-related technological innovations that have led to major transformation of how we communicate. Think of how writing, oil painting in the Renaissance, printing press, the telegraph, electronic media, and the internet have all fundamentally changed how we interact with others, but also even with ourselves. Now, Mitchell tells us, however, that technological innovation is not the only reason why media cultures change. There are other factors, like the political or economic contexts in which societies evolve through time. And he gives the example of how the history of media in the United States is different from the one in Europe, although the technology is largely the same. But Mitchell tells us that there is one constant in all of this. There is one element in the evolution of media cultures that is quite the same whether we study it in Europe, Asia, or the United States. And that is the dominance of the image in the history of media, or rather, as he puts it, the problem of the image. It is the way in which people relate to images in cultures, and that relationship is almost always ambivalent. Media are, in fact, they have always been largely dominated by images independently of where people live and in what period. Images have been crucial in Abrahamic religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, also in Nazi Germany, for the Soviet communists, and even the Taliban, who are ruling Afghanistan again today. The Taliban are an interesting example, according to Mitchell, because they ban images, which tells us how strongly they feel about them, how they perceive images as a sort of a threat against their worldview. In a word, they understand how important they are. They know that images can turn to idols, and they have the potential to become something people would worship, like a god. But this way of looking at images is perhaps not particularly useful for us since we want to study and understand media, not like or dislike aspects of it. We want to examine media. And this is why we need to look at image as a critical term. and that means as a tool that we can use to analyze media. Now, in order to do this, we must define what an image is, right? And Mitchell gives us a good definition that we can work with. He says that an image is a sign or symbol of something by virtue of its sensuous resemblance to what it represents. Now, the language he uses to define image should remind you of the lecture on semiotics. Note the terms sign and icon that Mitchell borrows from C.S. Peirce. Mitchell also tells us that an image must possess a quality that he calls firstness, in the sense that it functions as an icon. And the word firstness, the term firstness and icon, are the words that he actually gets from C.S. Peirce, right? So an image does not only represent or signify, but has inherent qualities such as color, texture, or shape, things that above all hit our senses. These qualities will then elicit a resemblance to something else, right? And the example that I gave you, that I've given you on this slide, illustrates this very nicely, right? This painting from Magritte. What we see as the image here on the slide is not a pipe, right? It is color, shape, it's canvas, the original. But it is shape or color or texture that is like something else. It is like a real pipe in real life. According to Mitchell, images have two dimensions, spatial and temporal. They are representations of objects that are perceived in space, out in the world, right? But also they are perceived in time. They're not only perceived in space. Mitchell tells us that there are two moments in our interaction with the image. The first moment is the moment of the onset of the image. It's the moment of recognition. It's when we notice it being there as an image. And there is a second moment, and that moment is when we realize what it refers to. So basically, there are two moments. There is the moment of recognition and the moment of realization. We can call them this way. Now, time can also be present in other aspects of the image. For example, in the data production. Some images contain that information. Or sometimes images have historical narratives. That's what they represent. And even though the image is still, there's always the element of motion in time in it. And the best example that Mitchell gives us really is the surveillance pictures that you can see also in the slide. And these images of surveillance are documented to the millisecond, and we see how important time is in terms of what they refer to. So by image, we primarily mean visual image. But it's important to know that not all images are visual. For example, mental images, images that we have in our memories and dreams, or metaphor, and really forms of figurative language, what we call in French langage imagé. And it's really interesting that we use imagé, like imagery, when we talk about language. So this in itself tells us that images are not always visual images. They're not always addressed only to the eye. But there is a default meaning. That's what Mitchell tells us. And when we talk about image really in media studies, what we really refer to are visual media, like painting, photography, cinema, television, or Instagram, TikTok. These are media that are fundamentally addressed to the eye. And visual media are distinguished in this sense from, say, verbal media, print media basically, literature, books, and newspapers. Now, this distinction might be helpful for us, but in real life, these distinctions don't really work this way. In fact, most media we consume is almost always a mixture of visual and verbal and sometimes even acoustic media. Think of the videos that we consume on Instagram, right? The short videos, or on TikTok. They're always a mixture. There are words and images, sometimes still and motion, and it's always a mixture. It's almost never only one of these, right? So Mitchell also makes a very interesting point in this section of the text when he talks about how print media itself is above all visual. Why? Because we read with our eyes. The letters that are typed on a sheet of paper are addressed to the eyes. That's why we have so many fonts and options in terms of how the text would look like in Word, for example. The last section of Mitchell's text deals with digital image, right? And he starts this section by saying that we cannot really talk about images without saying a few things, at least, about digital images. According to Mitchell, there are generally two ways to think of how digitalization, la numérisation in French, has changed the way we understand images we interact with today. And how do we interact with images today? It's basically through computers or smartphones or tablets, electronic devices, really. We interact with images mostly on screens, right? One line of thinking argues that digitization has fundamentally transformed our relationship with images, because computer-generated or computer-mediated images no longer have the quality of an index. Recall C.S. Peirce's idea that images have both iconic and indexical linkages to real objects, and I'm particularly referring to the picture of the cat in Dr. Kenny's presentation from last week. So they are no longer images after the digitization. They are no longer based on natural or chemical reactions of light that comes off the surface of an object that is then reflected and inscribed on the photograph. But they are generated by computer codes, right? Zeros and ones. Now, this line of thinking supposes the end of the analog experience. So note the two words. We have digital on the one hand and analog. So that was the first line of thinking, right? The radical break with the analog experience. There is a second line of thinking, according to Mitchell, and this line of thinking argues that, well, although the essence, the ontology of the image is quite different now as a result of digitization, zeros and ones and not chemical reactions, we do perceive and treat digital images in quite the same way as we treat analog images, except that digital images are much easier to access, actually, or copy, or distribute, or even share. Think of how easily you share and distribute photos on Instagram or on your WhatsApp. Moreover, if anything, digitization has enabled us to interact with images on a completely different scale. We can use Photoshop and treat images really as interfaces and manipulate them as we please, as long as we know how to work with image editing software like Photoshop. And this is precisely what you learn as part of your studies here at ISTC, and that is the manipulation of images using computers. So digitization and the way in which it has transformed not only images but really our entire media experience and communication is a very, very big topic, and we will come back to it in future lectures. For now, use the information I gave you and go back to Mitchell's text and try to make sense of it. And then use both the video and the text to answer the questions and be prepared for class. All the best and see you soon.